This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from the capital city of Quito in Ecuador, a breathtakingly beautiful Latin American country which has the rugged, soaring volcanic Andes Mountains, a nation currently in political turmoil with a state of emergency and political assassinations, and straddles the equator on the west coast of South America, just below the country of Colombia and above Peru. He is an Ecuadorian diplomat and former foreign affairs minister. He has served in public office as Foreign Affairs Minister between July 2020 and March 2021. He was the formal representative to the United Nations for his country in New York City and Geneva, and he has served as a diplomat in multiple countries around the world. He has served in several positions at the United Nations and has also been widely decorated in his country of Ecuador and internationally. In Ecuador, he received a National Order of Merit and the nation's highest decoration. Abroad, he has been decorated in Bulgaria, France, Brazil, El Salvador, Guatemala, Spain, and Peru. Like me, he is a Harvard ALI Fellow. He leads global initiatives on disability, on aging, and changing world demographics. So stay tuned as he shares more with us about saying no to a president and being decorated for doing so. His Mandela moment, statesmanship and leadership, and the power of confronting the future with bold choices today for a better tomorrow. We warmly welcome my dear friend, Luis Gallegos, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. So, Louis, my friend, it's always a joy to see you. Thank you so much for being part of this movement and part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you.
That's wonderful. You know, I thought a great place to begin, Ecuador. You know, it's part of, it's a country in South America I have yet to come and visit. I look forward to doing that someday and meeting up with you and your wonderful family. I'm intrigued by Ecuador. You know, from the little bit that I know about it, it's on the west coast of South America. It's below the country of Colombia and north of Peru. And I think you have a population of just over 18 million people. You have held some really important positions in this beautiful country of yours. I wondered, as the former Foreign Affairs Minister, which I think was a position you held from July 2020 to March 2021, and also you an ambassador to New York and to Geneva, and you've held various diplomatic posts around the world. What I wanted to ask you, coming from your country, Ecuador, what is the uniqueness of Ecuador, and what is the message you take from Ecuador when you have these different diplomatic meetings and representations around the world?
Well, Anne, let me begin by saying that I worked as a foreign service officer for Ecuador for 52 years, in two stages really. One, I worked for around 46 years. And then I asked to be, to have a leave because I wanted to venture into the private sector and do some humanitarian work on my
Yeah.
own, and especially on the issues of disability and human rights.
Yeah.
So I left the foreign ministry and worked in the private sector and with the multilaterals. And then the president of Ecuador asked me to come back. The then president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, asked me to then come back. And I was again asked to be ambassador in Geneva, then to New York. And when the pandemic hit, I was asked to be foreign minister in a very complicated circumstance of the world, which we probably will be talking about. And so I worked with the Foreign Service for 52 years.
Yeah.
My family has been involved in public service forever in the history of Ecuador, and my grandfather was also a vice president and ambassador, and my father was an ambassador to the UN. So I grew up in a family of public service,
Yes.
and the fundamental premise was that you had to give back. You had to represent the interests of your country in a very competitive world, in a very complicated circumstance. And as I look back at my 50 years or my 76 years of life, I have lived through the bipolarity of confrontation between the East and the West. I've seen a number of wars happen. I've even participated in the solving of internal and external wars. I've been a member of the Committee Against Torture on the UN Convention Against Torture and Ill Treatment. I've had the honor of being vice president of the Human Rights Commission and then the Human Rights Council. I have been ambassador to Geneva 3 times. I've initiated processes of creating binding international instruments for multinational activities in countries, especially in favor of the victims. I've also proposed, I chaired the UN Convention on Disability from 2002 to 2005. I am proposing now and working with the working group in New York to promote a UN Convention on Aging.
Yeah.
But Ecuador is a staunch believer in human rights. The first High Commissioner of Human Rights was an Ecuadorian, and most of us have been working in this field for many times. Let me also say that the endeavor is to make a world more equitable and inclusive. So I work with many organizations on the issues of inclusion of persons with disabilities and persons who are aging. And because of the pandemic, I decided to work more intensively in proposing this UN international binding treaty to protect and promote the rights of people who are aging, because this group and disability were the most affected by the pandemic. I define the pandemic as the crisis of the century.
Mm-hmm.
Because it affected every country in the world. It affected 193 members of the United Nations, but it also had a particularity which we did not confront as a humanity in this century, and that is that it affected each one of us.
Yeah.
We know people who have died, who are friends of ours, relatives of ours, and so on. And that symbolism that you could die has had an impact on the world stage, which is still being studied.
Mm-hmm.
The implications in the economy, the implications in the workplace, the implications in the health systems, the whole nature of a new type of relationship in the world is there. One of the traits politically and analytically is that people have lost trust in their governments, have lost trust in the governance, have lost trust in the effectiveness of democracies and other types of government. So I see a future of the need for new consensus building, new capabilities to confront these daunting these daunting problems. The demographics of the world are inverted. We are now more aging than children being born. That will be a huge shift in the population factor of the world. We are confronting a climate disaster as we move forward, and we see every day in our television screens and in our mobile social media. We see the incapacity of reaching agreements by societies and nation states, both internally and externally, a raise in the insecurity, civil insecurity in many parts of the world. So there are challenges that we have to meet as a world community, and that the United Nations is trying. At least the Secretary General, who Antonio Gutierrez, has said many times that we need to create a new agreement, a new social pact amongst the nations of the world to confront these problems, because we need the political will and we need the political knowledge and consciousness of the societies in order to make this to make it to confront these challenges.
But just to interject for a sec, Louis, and I'm listening with great admiration in terms of your family background, and you're referencing that Ecuador has always been a country committed to human rights. Thinking about what smaller countries can bring to the future of leadership, what smaller countries bring to the United Nations, apart from this passion and culture of respect and dignity, for inclusiveness, for human rights, what is it, do you think, that is unique about Ecuador that brings an important part to this conversation?
Well, I normally define the issue of a division in the United Nations of the 193 members of the United Nations between those that are the founders of the United Nations, those who won the World War, and then the integration of the United Nations was done only by 55 countries, amongst them Ecuador. After the Second World War, with decolonization and with other factors and division of nation states, you had a number increase up to 193. There will probably be more members historically as nations become independent. But the United Nations has a division amongst those who have agendas, international foreign policy agendas of global contexture or importance, and those who can solve the problems, be goodwill officers of trying to look into this, because both their countries and themselves as individuals do not have a particular agenda or interest to eschew the problem. I was facilitator with the ambassador of Liechtenstein in New York for the reform of the Security Council. I think that's a valid example. So Ecuador doesn't have nuclear weapons. It doesn't have any interests of warfare in that case. And Liechtenstein and I worked for a year consulting the membership on how we could reform the Security Council so it would be more equilibrium for the new countries that had become independent since the last reform of the Security Council. There are 15 members of the Security Council, 5 permanent members who hold veto power, who are those who won the war, and 10 elected members from the 5 regional groups, so 2 for each group. At the present moment, Ecuador is a member of the Security Council. But I think that there is a value added of individuals who can represent the United Nations in peacekeeping operations, in representing development in different parts of the world, who do not originate necessarily from countries of the North. Their knowledge of what happens in the global South is extremely important, because most of the problems we have are in the global South.
Yeah.
We have to look at that equilibrium in development and enrichment of life of those populations in order to have a more inclusive world, but more than that, also a more normal and equal world.
Yeah.
Uh, I find that you also have to speak with the voice of data and reflection, but also with the voice of principle
Hmm.
uh, when you deal with in negotiations in whatever field, both in the relationships in the United Nations, both in New York, Geneva, or in any other place where the United Nations has meetings, and the same with the bilateral relations. I was also ambassador to Australia, to El Salvador, to the United States.
To
And
Bulgaria, to Spain.
yeah, and
Yeah.
as a career member, I was third secretary in Spain and second secretary. So I began from the bottom up.
Yeah,
I
but
became,
you've had incredible, diverse global experience, you know. I think to that point, Louis, what is your definition of leadership? Number one. And number two, what are your thoughts around the future of leadership?
well, I think leadership is one of the issues that we are really looking into. As you know, I spent last year in Harvard at the Advanced Leadership Initiative, and I also am a part of the Harvard Law School Disability Project. I'm a senior advisor there uh, since many years ago, and I believe that leadership is a component of many elements, especially in a democracy.
Yeah.
Uh, you need first the capability of leadership to convince the people who vote for you that your proposals are those that are linked to their interests, to their principles, to what they aspire for their children or grandchildren, or for the future of the nation.
Yeah.
In very complicated international scenarios, where many of the phenomenon that is occurring outside the borders of your country will impact your people. I think, the pandemic is an extraordinary example, but I can give you many others in where a confrontation in the Ukraine, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, will create a food crisis around the
Sure.
world, or
Sure.
fertilizer crisis around the world.
Yeah.
The implications are now, because of the dimensions of globalization and interlinkages, one of the principal complexities of this. And leadership demands that you have a principled vision of what you want and what you do and what you propose, and that you have the capacity of understanding the needs of your constituents,
Mhm.
representing them with dignity and with intelligence, because these are also issues of interests. Uh, and you also have to be able to have a leadership role in galvanizing consensus, galvanizing the possibility of dialogue, which the polarization of the political establishment, both worldwide and in many nations, is under attack. I think one of the principal issues today is the incapacity of agreement, the
Mm.
incapacity of being able to have mutual consensus building, and the polarization of positions to the point of aggressiveness, which put a very complex mechanism of problem resolution into this.
Yeah.
Because what you're trying to do is solve problems,
Yeah.
avoid conflicts, or diminish the impact of the crisis and conflicts. Some of these will come to you naturally. We here are preparing. We're in Ecuador. We here are preparing for the phenomenon of called El Nino. It's a current, a heating of the oceans in different parts of the world, and it will bring massive torrential rains to the west coast of Latin America, but it
Yeah.
will bring drought to the rest of the world, and it will
Yeah.
affect climate in unpredictable ways at the present moment. It will primarily destroy your food supply, your capability of farming. It will destroy your infrastructure. We have had these events during the last decades, in my lifetime for at least 4 or 5 times. But the notion that you have an international phenomenon that will affect billions of people
Sure.
require a world vision of how you deal with this problem.
Yeah.
Not only
So
from
that
the
would be
climate.
around the future of leadership, looking instead of being focused on national borders, national issues, these big issues that transcend our national borders require a new global vision.
Yes, and I think that unfortunately, uh, we have a problem of parochialism in this, or limitation. All politics is local, as the slogan says. All
Yeah,
politics is local. You have to have the votes of your constituents. So
sure.
your primary concern is that. And your constituents might not understand that the oil prices they are paying now depend on the crisis where the oil is supplied,
Yeah,
or the migration crisis that is happening is because of measures that have been taken to impede the development of those nations, or a regimen of sanctions that has impeded the growth of a particular set. So you need to know the counterbalances of the world in order to understand how to govern nationally. There are a series of mechanisms around the world. One of them is the United Nations, but you also have others that where the leaders meet, where the leaders exchange views, combine purposes and interests. But fundamentally, what you're looking for is the welfare of your nation, the defense of the interests of your nation, of the sovereignty of your nation, and of course the capabilities of growing in development, having a more prosperity, more jobs for your population, better healthcare, excellent healthcare for your people, and now a prerequisite of everything is an excellent education. The
yeah,
world is interconnected. You have internet all over the world. The cell phones have become computers of communication and knowledge. In Ecuador, we have more cell phones than people.
yeah,
And you look at technology and artificial intelligence as part of the formula of how you will look into the solution of the problems.
sure.
Now, um, leadership in itself is not something that you are born with. The traits of leadership may be personal in one part, but they're also preparedness. There's also the level of education, the level of training you require, and the level of knowledge and the experiences you gather during your lifetime of being a person who has had responsibilities of leadership.
Yeah. And
So,
to that point, I would love you to share with us, because you make such an important point, Louis. In your young life, you mentioned your grandfather was in public service, your father was in public service. Is there a specific event, a specific moment in time that you recall that really left a lasting impression, was a defining moment for you? What was that moment? When was it? How did you feel at the time? And how did that shape you?
well, I think that we have had in the history of Latin America a number of dictatorships, military dictatorships that
Hmm.
were sponsored in many cases from outside. And my father taught me an enormous lesson when I was a teenager,
Hmm.
uh, because we were involved he was involved in combating dictatorship, and he went to jail for that, and he also went out into the streets to protest. And some of the cases we would accompany him, but fundamentally it was the nature of an action, a principle in the fight for democracy, and that I think inbred in all in myself and my brothers,
Yeah,
sisters, a knowledge that you have to be a part of the solution. You have to be a part of the change. Um,
yeah. Was
my
there a
grandfather,
particular incident? I mean, can you take us back to a specific moment in time?
yes, of course, there are particular incidents in where you're followed by the security police, and you learn how to do these things. I think that you also learn the value of freedom, value of democracy, value of decision making,
Mm-hmm.
and you understand the the need to have a government that is checked and balanced by other fundamentals of government. I also saw this when I worked behind the Iron Curtain. I worked behind the Iron Curtain, and you had totalitarian governments, and you had totalitarian governments that where people got arrested if they did not agree
What
with the
part of
government.
the world and when was that again? Can you give
I
me
was in
those?
Bulgaria. I was stationed in Bulgaria as chief of mission in 85 to 89, and then the wall fell and Europe changed.
Yeah.
I was in the first of May of 1989. I was in Moscow, and I was invited to the parade, the parade in Red Square. If anybody would have asked me if in my lifetime I would see the Soviet Empire collapse, I would have said absolutely not.
Yeah.
You would see the nuclear weapons, the planes, and so on. It in October of that year, the Velvet Revolution began, and the wall of Berlin and the Iron Curtain fell in what was a paradigm change that many of the young people do not understand, that we had a confrontation of bipolarity, to the sense that this was a not only in Europe, in the division of the European scenario, but also in nations like ours, like yours and mine. And so
Yeah.
the issue of leadership always reminds me that you have to have a principled leadership.
Yes.
An illustrated, I'm trying to make it a Spanish translation here. An illustrated, if I can use the term, is an educated, intellectual, knowledge-based leadership that can be used for the benefit of the country
Mm-hmm.
and the benefit of your people.
Mm-hmm.
What is the actual interest of the country?
Sure.
What is the fundamental interest of an individual?
Yeah.
A man or woman, I think all human beings around the world want a stable life, work, dignity that you get from having your own capabilities of sustainability. You want a better future for your children and your grandchildren. You want a nation at peace without the insecurity of walking the streets with terror in your eyes.
Sure.
What you
And
want is,
Philip, I mean, I'm curious, when you went through that childhood experience with your father, when he went to prison, how did you feel? How long was he in prison for? And how did you navigate through that crisis moment in your
well,
family?
it was a family crisis, but it
Yeah.
was a family. It was a national crisis also, because many of the leadership were taken into custody. Some were exiled, others were jailed. Uh, I think that it was a short time in months and weeks, but the lessons learned is that the reaction of the population was such that the dictatorship had to sit down and negotiate a way out for a democratic solution to the Ecuadorian crisis.
What year was
Um,
that?
that was 66, 67.
Yeah.
And by 68, we had a return to the constitutional order. And by 69, we had a more stable government. The principle of what you learn in these sequences, because Ecuador and Latin America have had these incidents all along its life. Um, I think the basis of that of that is not only the interests of the parties or the infighting between the political groups. It's also the nature of a systemic exclusion of minorities. You cannot have a stable government unless you include all the stakeholders of the nation. This is
Sure.
not for, and you lived through
Yeah.
apartheid and others, and you know that the Mandela example is an example for all of us. that you can sit down after you've been jailed for 30 years and be able to dialogue with those for the benefit of the people.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the extraordinary
Yes.
examples of the world in this sense. If Mandela, Gandhi, and a few others, Martin Luther King and others, who were part of a school of thought of consensus building, the nature of principled leadership,
Yeah.
the nature of how you deal with the problems of the world based on principle and not on only interests or the interests of your companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great segue, Louis. Talking about Mandela, can you share with us a particular moment in time during the journey and the long walk to freedom of Nelson Mandela, a moment that stands out for you, that really touched you in terms and perhaps shaped you in the way you think and act and lead today? What was your Mandela moment? When was it? How did you feel at the time?
Well, I think that I began to understand the issue of apartheid better when I was a teenager and Ecuador was having a Davis Cup championship, was participating in a Davis Cup championship in tennis. And Ecuador refused to play the South African team because of apartheid and lost.
And lost because they wouldn't play.
Yeah.
And
And so,
roughly what year was that?
that was probably the 60s.
The 60s. Okay.
And you understand the issue of apartheid because I also come. Ecuador is a multiracial society.
Yeah.
We have an important component of indigenous society. We have an important Afro-Ecuadorian community. We have an important group of different religions in Ecuador. We have populations distributed in very distinct regions of geographically speaking, both in the Amazon jungles and in the highlands and in the coastal regions. So we're a pluralistic country that has to understand the other culture better. To understand and navigate another culture is to be able to sit down and appreciate with empathy the differences of context of culture, and that taught us from very young. When I was very young, I grew up with indigenous communities. I grew up. I went to school and university with indigenous communities. To understand the differences of the cosmovision that you have, and that others have from the Western mentality or the Eastern mentality.
Sure.
Yeah, and of course, when you look at what Mandela did, to be an extraordinary example of saying, okay, we for the benefit of of South Africa, we will sit down with those who jailed us and persecuted and killed us, and we will negotiate the future of democracy.
So was that your moment when he came out of prison, negotiating the Constitution?
And then I met him personally in one of the visits to South Africa.
So when was that? Where was that?
That was in 2000 or 2001 or 2. There was a non-aligned summit meeting in South Africa, and I was sent as chief of the Ecuadorian delegation. I had the enormous respect for an individual who would go beyond his personal interests and be able to be so extraordinarily human that he was able to do this and in dialogue with others. Then I met him in other meetings around the world where he would have a very important discourse to teach all of us, because I thought it was a lesson to the world. You can sit down and say, you need to dialogue. You need to negotiate. You need to build consensus. You need to build national agreements, national accords amongst all your constituents to confront the future. If you don't do that, you will have a problem of inequity. You will have a problem of rivalry, of incapacity of of agreement, you will also have something that becomes a chaos of interests internally and externally. So I also think that when you see the Fabiola, my wife, and I visited South Africa once, and I had read extensively about the apartheid and South Africa, and we wanted to see Soweto.
Yes.
We wanted to
Outside
visit Soweto.
Johannesburg.
Yeah, and so we asked and we prepared and we went to visit the Mandela home.
Yeah, in
where Winnie Mandela lived.
Yeah.
And I was struck by an anecdote there because in the window of this small house, there was a tree. There was a tree in the window that had grown, and that the person who was explaining this was explaining that they planted the tree because the police would shoot from a hill at the bedroom. And so they planted the tree. Now, when this example I'm giving now really puts you in the sense of this was physical danger. This was death, life or death.
Yeah.
And this went on for 30 years.
When you spoke about the tree, was the idea to plant the tree so it obstructed the window so there wasn't a clear vision for those shooters? Was that the purpose of the tree?
Yeah, that was the purpose of the tree.
Okay.
And I found it extraordinarily complex because the tree grows in 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. But people who were relentless in their purpose, and when you talk about leadership, you also talk about that, the persistence, the capability of persistence, the capability of doing this, and many times the sacrifices you have because of leadership.
So is there an example, Louis, that you can give us, just a very specific example, where you have had to make a sacrifice in a relentless pursuit of purpose? Is there a very specific example where you've made some tough decisions? It was a difficult moment, a defining moment. Can you take us back? What was the moment?
When I was a very young diplomat, I was stationed I was the Consul General of Ecuador in Chicago.
Yeah.
I was 27 at the time, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And I was Consul General in Chicago, and I had a food donation by the World Food Organization. And as a Consul General, you signed the papers to authorize the boat, the ship, to take the tons of wheat that were being given to Ecuador. This is something very positive.
Yeah.
Okay. So the person who came into my office came with the documents. We would do this with certain regularity. This was a donation, but we would buy also wheat as a government. So I asked her for the certificate of health, the certificate to guarantee that this wheat was able for human consumption.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't have that. And I said, I can't sign it because I can't send something that I doubt in my mind that would affect the health of those who receive it. Yeah. But it's a donation. It might be a donation, but you have to give me it'll take 3 days, and it will cost tens of thousands of dollars to keep the boat anchored in the seaport. Well, it's a lake port because it was in Chicago, in the Great Lakes. To do that, and I said, sorry. So I got calls from Washington, from my embassy in Washington, from the Ministry of Agriculture in Ecuador, from the Ministry of Foreign Relations, of course. And they asked me, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And I said, I'm stopping until she gives me the health certificate. I won't sign the papers.
Yeah.
and they said, we order you to sign the papers. And I said, you can't, because this is my responsibility. And if I sign, if you want, you can sign the papers.
Yeah.
And they said, no, you have to send it. So I said, okay. So 48 hours later or 72 hours later, the papers came in and the boat left.
He signed the papers.
No. The woman brought me the papers that said that. Yeah.
She brought you the certificate.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Brought me the certificate, but during those 2 days,
Yeah.
I went back home and told my wife, we're probably going to have to pack. I've had many times in which I've had discussions with presidents of Ecuador or people where I would maintain a position and they would say, no, we have to do it this way. Sorry, I can't do that.
So Louis, in that process, what is it? Just take us through. How do you pivot through that process? What are the key mechanisms and tools that you use to stand firm and steadfast? And how do you pivot through the process?
I think you have to have a consciousness of the cost of the decision.
Yeah.
I learned, and I learned this when I was when I began my career. I learned this concept that if you would be ashamed of what you did, if it got into the papers, if your wife and sons and daughters learned of what you did, it would be recommendable not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the measure of principle is to say there are consequences to your decision. I don't wear rings, as you see, because of the pandemic. But when I was when I got married in Ecuador, it's the tradition for I was the first of my brothers and sisters, and I inherited my grandfather's ring. And when I got the ring, my father told me, use the ring, because don't use the ring, and always remember that when you sign a paper, there are consequences to your signing it.
Mm-hmm.
Because when one is, in these posts you have responsibilities and you have consequences.
Yeah. So
you have to say no.
Yeah.
You have to learn that, fine, it's a job. It's a very important situation. I'm very honored to be ambassador or minister, but there are situations in where you have to define that in order to sleep tranquilly, and with a clear conscience, it's better to say no.
Yeah.
Now, in my experience, people have reacted in basically two ways. One has said, okay, he doesn't want to do this. Okay, don't. And in many cases, I had one of them, a case with one of the presidents of Ecuador. I won't mention his name because he's still living. He asked me for my opinion on something issue. He called me from outside out of the country, and I came for a very complicated meeting, and I was the only one in the cabinet room that was against the decision that the president was consulting, and I said so. So I went back and told Fabiola, look, I think we have to pack. I think we have,
you did a lot of thinking about packing, Louis.
No, because you're in a foreign country, you have to, when you decide when this is, and so eventually, when the president left, was leaving, I sent him a message saying, I wish you the best, many successes. It's been a pleasure working with you, and so on. And he did take my advice. So he did take my advice, and he called me and said, "Look, you were the only person in that room that was against my decision, and everybody was saying yes. And after thinking about it, I was very angry. But after thinking about it, you were right, and you were the only person who who had the guts to say no. And that, and because of that, I'm going to give you a national declaration. I am signing the decree in which I give you a national declaration, because you were the person who based his argument on principle. When you do these types of decision making in leadership, you have to acknowledge that if you maintain a position, you're maintaining it with a basis of argumentation and principle, on basis of principle, on basis of reality, on basis of the common interests of the country. And if they don't agree, you can't go with the tide. I was willing to leave at a very high cost for my family, of course, for my family or for my, but that was the nature of the situation. And this is not as an histrionic issue or a heroic issue. I think it's the basis of governance, of leadership. I also learned that you needed people that surrounded you that were better than you, that were more intelligent, more capable, more understanding, and that you learned from them, and not yes.
Yeah, people who will disagree.
I don't like people that say yes.
Yeah.
I want to know what they are actually thinking. If they think it's an adequate position, on the long term, you decide. I decided.
Sure, but it's getting the different perspective. It's understanding the different perspective. No, that's a great example. Shifting to a slightly lighter note, a couple of fun facts about you. I know you have 2 wonderful children. What has been the most difficult part of balancing a high-profile international career with being a good father? What has been the most difficult part of that for you? And what has been the most joyful part of that for you?
Well, I think that being a diplomat and having children is one of the greatest challenges a family can have, because thanks to Fabiola and her managing of the family in different circumstances, these children could have been completely lost in the constant changes of cultures and educational systems and languages and the adaptation is the capability of being adaptable to another country, another culture. I had a case with my daughter. My daughter, Maria Cristina, learned to divide with the Anglo-American system, which is different than the Latin Ecuadorian division system. So she was in school here, and they asked her to go to the board and do the division, and she did, and the result was but it was a different system that the professor, that the teacher didn't understand how she got there.
Yeah.
So we were called in. Well, she got a 0, so we were called in, and we actually had to explain to the teacher that she was doing what she learned. But that the teacher was worried that the rest of the class was completely confused by what she did. Okay, so it's understandable from one point of view, but from the other, for her, it was a lesson of adaptation. And I'm talking about educational system. So if you jump from a Spanish, Ecuadorian system of education to an Anglo-Saxon, American system, and to a French system, and to whatever other systems, languages are cultures, are forms of thinking, are patterns of thinking. I'm an Ecuadorian. I'm an Ecuadorian lawyer. I am basically, my reasoning pattern comes from the deductive thinking of Mediterranean cultures, the Spanish, French, Napoleonic codes, and so on. So I deduct. Anglo-Saxons induct. Anglo-Saxons and all those who were colonies of the Anglo-Saxon, induct. So we think different. We can agree on some of the things verbally, but when you write, you will be in it. So you have to know this for negotiations.
Sure.
You have to know this for not only for diplomatic negotiations, for contractual, for contracts of whatever exploitation you want or trade or whatever. You have to know these types of things. And in the education of these children, you had to be aware that they were in different thought patterns and reasoning capabilities to in argumentation. So in the long run, the cost benefit is that they learned
To adapt.
to be adaptable to cultures, to adapt to cultures, to understand others better,
Yeah, and different
be
thinking.
able to talk to people
Yeah.
From different cultures, because they were all in the same boat.
Yeah.
You know, they were African or they were Asian or they were Latin Americans in a different culture. They were all in the same with different particularities. So they became the two of them. My son works in Korea in our embassy in Korea as a trade officer, and he's married to a Korean American. My daughter is married to a biologist from the Netherlands, and she lives in Rwanda.
In Rwanda in Africa.
Yeah.
Very
And she's writing her PhD on communication and resilience.
wonderful. So tell me, what is the joyful part of being a father?
Well, I think that this is the reality which I am getting to, the point of saying these two of my children are all over the world. We do not have a nuclear family next to you. We meet, sometimes provoke meetings in different parts, and we look at those as possibilities. The last time we met for Christmas was in Rwanda.
Oh, wonderful. That's awesome.
And so
another fun fact. What do you think your children would say about you that has made a lasting impact on them?
That's a difficult question, because at a certain point in my life, around when I was probably 48 or 50, I sat down and wrote, I was not in business, so therefore I would not leave them a huge fortune or riches. The only thing I could leave them in reality was an example of what I would do as a person, and be able to teach them that there are causes like the world cause in disability, or an endeavor in human rights, that were worthwhile. Fundamentally, it's also the issue of saying, not only your children, but, and my wife has been an extraordinarily important part in my life on this, how the two of us, and as a consequence they, would live our lives in a very complex international situation, in a very demanding, challenging world society, and be able to represent adequately our country, but adequately also our principles. And I thank God for the opportunities. I'm a believer. I'm a Catholic. I also think that that has been a very important part of my life, to be able to look into what we have done and what we will do in the next years on issues of importance. I learned a lesson from which is fundamentally a Jewish rabbinical, from the Talmud, that says, if you save one life, your life is worthwhile. And I think that when you talk about the impact you would have, I never thought it would be possible to have an impact on 1.3 billion persons with disabilities.
Yeah.
Or change the nature of how world society would view this issue. Now, with 20 years of working on this issue, working with them, working side by side with person with disabilities and the leadership of this extraordinary group. You're either born with a disability or you acquire it during your life by accident, by sickness, by war, like we have now, or the 60 wars that are going on currently in the world. But when you age, you will have a disability.
Yeah.
So it's not about this minority of people who are, it's about us. If we can change our societies to be more understanding, more empathic, to have more empathy with people, we would have a more universal.
Absolutely.
And more so now that we have a demographic problem in which we are 1 billion people who are aging.
Yeah.
And we are going to be 2 billion people who are aging by the year 2050.
Yeah.
If you multiply, we normally do this technically and say, for every person who is aging, you have at least an impact on two persons, husband, wife, daughter, caretaker, medical assistant, or whatever. You at least two. So at the present moment, we are 1 billion persons who are aging. We have an impact on 2 billion people. That makes us 3 billion. By the year 2050, which is 27 years from now, we will be 6 billion people who are aging in the impact group, with less children being born every day.
Sure.
So the demographics of this is a wicked problem to solve. And this is why it's so complex for governments and for entities to grasp that they need to take decisions now, because they think it's better to leave it to the next guy to do it, because the cost of political decisions is going to be very high.
Yeah.
These are the endeavors that I think they see, and they accompany me in many of these ventures, especially.
That's wonderful. I mean,
Fabiola.
To your point about being a good example to them, I mean, you have shared so many tough, difficult decisions and choices you've made in being that example for them. Third, quick fun fact. What is one of your favorite books that have a book that has really made a difference in the way you think about the world?
Well, I read extensively, but there are books that make a mark and that keep making marks, and that sometimes I have enjoyed very much during these last years Yuval Harari's books.
Which one stands out?
Yes, no, all of them, really, all of them, because I sometimes go back and read them. Another one, that The Conversation by Robert Livingston on racism. I think that is a book that has made me reread it to understand the complexity of the situation. But I read
Harvard Kennedy School professor.
Yes,
Harvard Kennedy School. Yeah.
Yeah, I read important books on biographies. My trade is basically I read a lot of biographies like Obama or McCain, or I read a lot of Western books on these issues. A lot of Latin American books, of course, or European. But my field of interest is politics, is foreign policy. So I read extensively on books that deal with this in a world that is in a constant change. So many of the issues that we would read in books some decades back are now more in articles in foreign policy or foreign affairs or these types of magazines where you have noted and referenced articles of this. And I also have an enormous tendency of going back to read the press. I like to read newspapers. I write an op-ed, therefore I think I like to read the op-ed pages of different newspapers around the world, now more in electronics than in paper, but I do that.
That's wonderful. So,
I dedicate a lot of time to reading in
yeah,
my, yes, at least a couple of hours a day.
that's wonderful, Louis. Just, we don't have too much time left, but there are a couple of quick questions I wanted to hear your perspectives on. Do you think Nelson Mandela's leadership is relevant in the world today? And if so, why?
I think his example is something that we cannot leave behind. I think the leadership Mandela demonstrated is something that the level of humility, the level of self-imposed discipline for a better good is something that is always going to be an example for the leadership of the world. But I'm not talking about only the ones who are presidents because they became presidents. No, I'm talking about every individual,
Yeah,
because the nature of that decision is how you conduct yourself in the world as a human being.
sure, sure. Any final thoughts you would like to leave for our generation and the next around the future of leadership?
Well, I think the world is evolving so rapidly with technology and with social change and
Yeah,
with very complex international problems that are not necessarily wars, like climate change or like the sustainable development or food capabilities of the world and sustainable food allocations and so on. We are confronting a major world survival dilemma now that is beginning, and you will require leaders to be very capable of knowing the problems, acknowledging the problems, and being able to present solutions to the problems. Now, there's a level of statesmanship that is needed
sure.
because many of the things that you will have to decide are not popular, are not based on client-based issues that you will get their vote again if you don't do this or that. The level of statesmanship is something that always is a good example of how to introduce. And Mandela demonstrated that because he sacrificed many things as a statesman for the better good of his people and as a lesson to the world. So I think that the level of statesmanship is the basis of leadership.
How do you define statesmanship?
The capacity of knowing that your decision will have a visionary or prolonged effect, and that you must decide this for the better, or for your understanding of the situation as the better, rather than to accommodate yourself with of what the polls and the national discussion of the political parties, or even what the people want to hear.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
cannot guide your life by trying to be popular,
sure,
and
sure.
that is something that you must look into and say, well, this is what is correct, what I think is correct, and I'm willing to do that, in spite that it might not be popular.
Absolutely. Louis, you are such a wonderful living example of somebody who's been a remarkable statesman. I have no doubt that you're a wonderful example to your children, and I look forward to hearing more about that. But thank you so much for showing up and being part of this global Mandela leadership movement for change. We all care about transforming our leadership crisis, reminding our generation, and empowering the next. And I'm so looking forward to seeing you again in person, my friend.
We
I know we have some scars we've shared together, but we have many positive possibilities to look forward to. Thank you for the gift of you. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, Anne, for this opportunity, and thank you. I know I am very appreciative of your invitation. Thank you, and God bless you, and take care of you.
Bless you too. As we reflect upon the compelling insights from our good friend Luis Gallegos, the former Foreign Affairs Minister of Ecuador and the UN representative for his country, I'm recording these leadership insights just 3 days before my gastric cancer surgery. This week is a big week. I'm pondering big questions about life, leadership, humanity, the world's future. And I'm wondering how I and we could and should confront the future. Like Louise, I believe we all have a duty and an obligation to stand up at times and say no, even to a president. But the biggest question and issue is, will I and we as humanity adapt, survive, and thrive, especially given the current, increasing, and significant threats and challenges of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, climate, and nuclear war prospects? How do we get there? To confront the future, we need to understand where we are and where we have come from. Louis reminds me of Yuval Harari's work in his book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, which sketches how humanity has evolved and developed thus far. Despite the book's mixed scholarly reviews, its multiple awards and best-selling lists helps us present a widely populist framework. Harari uses the intersection of the natural sciences, the natural world, with social sciences, our human interactive world, and how these two worlds intersect. Our natural world, the natural sciences, is telling us we're on high red alert. Our social sciences, our social interactive world, is telling us that humans are tearing apart instead of capitalizing on our unique ability to collaborate and to develop cognitive thinking capability to energize, mobilize, and harmonize right across the species. To confront the future, the world of today needs another major fifth revolution, a supercognitive revolution. What do I mean by that? Much bigger and better, higher order thinking. Let me give you an example. A self-transforming mind that is able to uniquely think about humanity as one species rather than man-made tribal divisions. Another example would be a new intelligence type like existential spiritual intelligence, which Mandela used to forgive his prison warders after 27 years in prison and invite them to his presidential inauguration. What the world needs now is a radical new way to think, act, and lead. And you too, armed with Mandela's leadership tools in your toolbox, can develop a super cognitive ability to transform yourself, to change a nation, and to galvanize the world. The future history of tomorrow will be judged by mine and your thoughtful, bold actions of today. So until next time, and post my surgery, bless you and thank you, and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog, and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.